Hey everyone, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and I am so pumped for today's deep dive. But, Sunny, what has been going on in your world this week? Anything exciting?
Well, Joe, let's just say my week has been a bit of a whirlwind. You know how I'm always trying new things.
Oh yeah, always up for an adventure.
Well, this week, that adventurous spirit led to a self-tanner mishap and a very orange cat.
Oh no, Sunny, you're going to have to tell me all about that later. But speaking of things that'll make you think, today we're diving into, you all know, Harari's TED interview. This guy is a total mind-blowing genius.
I know, right? Every time I listen to him, I feel like my brain is doing backflips.
Totally. So in this particular interview, Harari really dives into the power of stories, like how our understanding of things like fairness, justice, even history itself, are shaped by the stories we tell ourselves and each other.
It's like we're all living in these different narratives, right? And those narratives shape how we see the world and interact with each other.
Exactly. And Harari argues that sometimes trying to impose our own perfect world stories onto reality can actually lead to conflict and even war. It's like we get so attached to our own version of the story that we can't see any other perspective.
Oh, for sure. That totally makes sense. It's like when you're arguing with someone and you're both so convinced you're right that you can't even hear what the other person is saying.
Exactly. So Harari talks about these three big stories that have shaped human history. First, there's the fascist narrative, kind of a dark one, where it's all about survival of the fittest nations battling it out for dominance.
Yeah, not the most optimistic view of the world.
Definitely not. Then you've got the communist narrative, where history is this constant class struggle that eventually leads to one class ruling over all the others.
Right. And then there's the liberal narrative, which is all about shared human experiences and the idea that conflict arises from ignorance and misunderstanding. Harari seems to be more in line with this one.
Yeah, he definitely seems to be advocating for dialogue and understanding as the path to peace.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting when you consider his thoughts on the aggressor's grand narrative. What do you think about that whole idea, Sunny?
Oh, man, that's such a good point. Like how aggressors throughout history have always tried to justify their actions with these noble-sounding stories, even when it's clear they're mostly after power or resources.
Right. Like they wrap up their aggression in this shiny packaging of freedom and justice. But are they really buying into their own hype?
I mean, some of them probably are, but it makes you wonder about the psychology of it all. Like, do they need to convince themselves they're the good guys in order to sleep at night?
That's a great question. And it makes you think about all the times in history when this has happened. Like, take the Roman Empire, for example. They were conquering left and right, claiming to bring civilization to the barbarians. But it was really about expanding their territory and power.
Oh, yeah. Classic example. And it's something we still see today, right? Like countries going to war under the guise of humanitarian intervention. But really, there are other motives at play. It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
For sure. And it's not like these aggressors always need what they're fighting for.
Yeah.
Often they already have tons of resources and land. So what's driving them?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to ideology and those deep-seated narratives we were talking about earlier. Like they get so caught up in their own story about who's right and wrong that they lose sight of the human cost.
It's like they're blinded by their own beliefs.
Totally. It reminds me of this one time. So I was saying, it reminds me of this one time back in college when I was totally convinced my roommate was trying to sabotage my studying.
Oh. No roommate drama. Tell me more.
Yeah, it was finals week and I was super stressed. And she was always blasting music when I was trying to focus. Leaving her stuff everywhere was driving me crazy.
I feel you. I had a roommate who used to practice the bagpipes at like 3 a.m. It was brutal.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's even worse. Anyway, I was building up all this resentment like she was the enemy, and I was about to confront her about it.
Oh, I bet that would have been good.
But right as I was about to go off on her, she came in looking totally distraught. Turns out she'd just gotten some bad news from home and was barely holding it together.
Oh, wow. So your whole narrative just went out the window.
Totally. It was like a slap in the face. I'd been so focused on my own little bubble of stress that I completely missed what she was going through.
That's such a good point. It's so easy to get caught up in our own perspectives and forget that everyone else is dealing with their own stuff too.
For sure. And it really ties back to what Harari's saying about how our narratives can actually distort our perception of reality. We create these stories in our heads and then we start seeing evidence for them everywhere, even if it's not really there.
Like confirmation bias, basically.
Exactly. And just like those aggressors we were talking about earlier, I had created this enemy in my mind to justify my own feelings. It's pretty crazy how our brains work sometimes.
It is fascinating.
Sure.
But I think it's also hopeful because If we can recognize that we're doing this, we can start to challenge our own narratives and be more open to other perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of seeing the bigger picture, Harari talks about how levels of violence have actually fluctuated throughout history. It's not this constant, unchanging thing like some people believe.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. Like, you always hear about how humans are inherently violent, but according to Harari, the early 21st century was actually the most peaceful period in human history.
I know, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
We were spending less on the military than on healthcare. It shows that peace isn't this impossible dream. It's something we can achieve, but it takes effort and awareness.
Totally. And as Harari points out, it's a fragile peace. It depends on our choices and actions. And right now it feels like things are shifting back towards violence pretty quickly.
It's like we're constantly teetering on the edge, right? Between peace and conflict. And our choices, both individually and collectively, will determine which way we fall. You know, one thing that really struck me was Harari's analogy of human societies being like rainforests.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
He argues that both thrive on cooperation, not just competition, which is such a refreshing perspective because we're often told that it's a dog-eat-dog world and it's all about survival of the fittest.
I love that analogy. It reminds us that we're all interconnected and our well-being depends on collaboration and mutual support. Like, we can achieve so much more when we work together.
Exactly. And Harari also challenges this idea that humans are just like other animals constantly fighting over territory and food. He says a lot of our conflicts actually stem from abstract ideas and imagined differences.
It's almost like we invent reasons to fight even when there's no real need for it.
Right. It all comes back to the power of narratives. Like Harari talks about Jerusalem, which has been the site of so much conflict over the centuries. And he says it's because people are so attached to their own stories about the city's history and significance.
Like they're trapped by their own narratives. Exactly. And his point is that we shouldn't study history just to dwell on the past or assign blame, but to liberate ourselves from these stories and imagine new possibilities for the future.
It's like we inherit this suitcase full of baggage from our ancestors, but we have the power to unpack it and decide what to keep and what to let go of.
I love that analogy. We're not prisoners of the past. We have the power to choose a different path for ourselves and for future generations.
And that leads to another important point Harari makes about our responsibility to future generations. He says the past is fixed, but the future is still being written, and our actions today will have ripple effects for centuries to come.
That's a powerful thought. It's like we're not just living for ourselves. We're shaping the world that our children and grandchildren will inherit.
Totally. It's a huge responsibility, but also an incredible opportunity. And, you know, when you think about it, this all ties back to that idea of the hedonic treadmill we were talking about earlier.
Right. How even as our material circumstances improve, our happiness levels tend to stay pretty much the same.
Exactly. And Harari is suggesting that maybe we're focusing on the wrong things. Maybe we're so busy chasing after power and possessions that we're neglecting the things that truly matter, like connection, meaning, and purpose.
That's a deep thought, Sunny. And I think it's a perfect segue into the final part of our Harari deep dive. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
All right, Sunny, so we're back, and we're wrapping up our deep dive into Yuval Noah Harari's ideas. Before the break, we were talking about the hedonic treadmill and how we might be missing the mark when it comes to true happiness.
It really makes you question what we're all striving for, doesn't it? Like, are we chasing the wrong things?
Absolutely. And it's funny because we often hear this narrative that happiness is all about achieving more, getting more, buying more. But Harari seems to be suggesting that that's not the whole story.
It's like we're told that happiness is this destination that we reach by accumulating stuff. But what if it's more about the journey?
Ooh, I like that. So if we're buying into the wrong narrative about happiness, how do we rewrite the script? How do we get off that treadmill and find a more fulfilling path?
Well, I think self-awareness is a good place to start. You know, like recognizing those stories we're telling ourselves about what will make us happy and questioning whether they're actually true.
So basically taking a step back and saying, hold on, is this really what I want? Or am I just following some pre-programmed script that society has given me?
Exactly. It's about challenging those assumptions and figuring out what truly brings you joy. And I think it also involves shifting our focus from external validation to internal satisfaction.
Meaning finding happiness from within rather than seeking it from outside sources.
Exactly. Like finding joy in the simple things, being grateful for what we have, connecting with nature, nurturing our relationships. things like that.
It's about finding meaning and purpose beyond the material stuff.
Right. And I think being mindful of the stories we're consuming plays a role too. Like if we're constantly bombarded with messages that equate happiness with wealth and status, it's no wonder we end up on that hedonic treadmill.
So it's like we need to be more critical of the narratives that are shaping our worldview. And maybe even start telling different stories, stories that celebrate things like kindness, compassion, and community.
Exactly. It's about changing the narrative from having more to being more. And that brings us back to Harari's main point. We have a choice. We can keep chasing illusions, or we can create a more meaningful path for ourselves and for future generations.
We have the power to shape our own destinies and the world around us.
And the stories we choose to tell will play a huge role in shaping that future.
That's a powerful message to end on, Sunny. We've covered so much ground today, from the power of narratives to the pursuit of happiness and our responsibility to future generations. It's been a mind-blowing deep dive into the world of Yuval Noah Harari.
Absolutely. It's definitely given us all a lot to think about.
Cheers to that, Sunny. And thank you all for joining us on Sip and Talk. We'll be back next time with more thought-provoking conversations. Until then, keep those minds buzzing and keep sipping.